Before asking why this case never reached a conclusion, we need to establish something more basic: what this case file actually was and what it was never designed to be. This file did not begin as a single, unified investigation. It began as a collection of documents. According to an internal memorandum dated October 11, 1969, materials related to the case were forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation through the Vallejo Police Department. That wording matters. The document does not describe the opening of a centralized investigation. It records the receipt of materials, not the assumption of case ownership. This distinction is critical. At this stage, the file consisted of individual items, correspondence, envelopes, coded material, and reports generated by local agencies. Each item existed because a specific event had occurred within a specific jurisdiction. What did not exist was a single administrative act that declared, "This is now one case, under one authority." There is no document from this period assigning overall responsibility. There is no directive establishing a lead agency. And there is no language indicating that the file had entered a consolidated investigative phase. Instead, the file functioned as an administrative record, a place where materials could be logged, examined upon request, and returned. Its structure reflected how it was received, fragmented by origin, not unified by design. This raises an essential question that the file itself does not answer. If no agency was formally designated to own the entire file, who was responsible for determining when the file was complete? Who had the authority to say that all available material had been reviewed together rather than separately? The documents from this period do not assign that responsibility. This does not indicate neglect, refusal, or inaction. It indicates something more structural. From the beginning, the file did not create a single obligation to resolve the case as a whole. It created multiple, limited obligations to examine specific items, and nothing beyond that. That structural limitation is not a conclusion. It is a condition. And it is the condition that shaped everything that followed. Once the file existed as a collection of documents, the next question becomes unavoidable. What authority did the file actually establish, and what authority did it not? The records from late 1969 are precise in their language. They consistently describe materials as being submitted, forwarded, or reviewed upon request. What they do not contain is language of ownership. There is no directive stating that the Federal Bureau of Investigation assumed lead responsibility for the case. There is no memorandum transferring jurisdiction from local agencies to a central authority. And there is no document establishing a unified chain of command. Instead, the file reflects parallel responsibility. Local agencies, including departments operating within their respective jurisdictions, retained control over their portions of the record. When materials were sent to the FBI, they were sent for specific purposes: technical review, comparison, or opinion. Once those purposes were fulfilled, the file did not record any automatic escalation to a broader investigative mandate. This distinction matters because authority in an investigation is not implied. It must be assigned. The documents from this period do not assign it. There is no recorded moment where one agency is instructed to reconcile all materials across jurisdictions. There is no language requiring that conclusions drawn in one location be formally reviewed against materials held elsewhere. And there is no administrative act that converts a set of related incidents into a single investigative obligation. The file is explicit about what agencies did. It is silent on who was required to do everything. That silence has consequences. Without a designated owner of the complete file, decisions could only be made within limited scopes. An agency could act on what it held. It could request assistance, but it couldn't compel consolidation. This does not indicate avoidance or failure. It reflects a file that never created the authority necessary to move the case into a unified phase of investigation. What the record shows is not a lack of effort. It shows a lack of mandate. And without a mandate, the file could grow, but it could not converge. At this point, the issue is no longer how materials moved between agencies. The issue is what the file itself never contained. A complete investigative file normally includes three basic elements: a master inventory of evidence, a record of comprehensive review, and a documented decision on next steps. In this case, none of those elements appear in the record. There is no consolidated inventory listing all known materials across jurisdictions. The file records individual items, letters, envelopes, reports, but it does not confirm that these items were ever assembled into a single, unified list. Without such an inventory, it is impossible to determine whether all available material was reviewed together or only in isolation. The file also lacks confirmation of comprehensive review. Documents note that certain materials were examined for specific purposes. What the record does not show is a point at which the file was assessed as a whole, where all evidence was evaluated against consistent criteria. There is no notation indicating that this stage was completed, postponed, or even considered. Most critically, the file contains no administrative decision that defines a transition. There is no recorded determination to escalate the case into a centralized investigation. There is no documented decision to close specific lines of inquiry. And there is no formal statement explaining why the file remained open without advancing to a new phase. This absence matters because investigations do not move forward on momentum alone. They move forward through documented obligations. In this case, the file created obligations to examine individual items when requested. It did not create an obligation to reconcile those examinations into a single conclusion. The record does not show failure. It shows incompleteness. And that incompleteness is structural, not personal. Without an inventory, no one can say what was fully reviewed. Without confirmation of comprehensive analysis, no one can say when review was complete. And without an administrative decision, no one can say what direction the investigation was formally authorized to take. The file does not explain these absences. It simply leaves them unaddressed. That silence is not a mystery. It is a boundary, one that limits how far the case could ever progress within the structure the file itself created. Once the file reached this state of incompleteness, a reasonable question follows. Why were these gaps never formally addressed? The record provides an indirect answer, not through explanation, but through timing and structure. By late 1969, the file had already assumed its operating form. Materials were reviewed when requested. Opinions were recorded when sought. But no document from this period establishes a new administrative phase for the case. There is no order to consolidate. There is no directive to inventory. And there is no mandate to reconcile findings across jurisdictions. This absence is not accidental. In the investigative framework of the time, authority did not expand automatically. A new mandate required a documented trigger, a formal decision to escalate, centralize, or reclassify the case. The file contains no such trigger. What it does contain are routine administrative actions, acknowledgments, forwarding notes, and technical responses. These actions fulfilled their immediate purposes without altering the structure of the file itself. As a result, the file continued to operate within the limits originally set by its design. Without an assigned owner, no agency was obligated to redefine the scope. Without a consolidated inventory, no review could be certified as comprehensive. And without a documented decision point, no transition to a new investigative phase could occur. This is not evidence of neglect. It is evidence of procedural containment. The file did exactly what it was structured to do, and nothing more. Importantly, the record does not show any moment where these limitations were formally acknowledged or challenged. There is no memo stating that the file required restructuring. There is no discussion of creating a centralized review mechanism. The issue is not that such steps were rejected. It is that the file never generated the authority to propose them. From an administrative perspective, the case did not stall. It remained active within a narrow operational lane. But without a mandate to widen that lane, the investigation could not redirect, converge, or conclude. The file did not fail to move forward. It was never authorized to move differently. By the time the file had settled into its long-term form, its limitations were already embedded. What remained was not an investigation moving toward resolution, but a record constrained by its own structure. The file did not contain a moment of closure. It did not contain a moment of escalation. And it did not contain a documented decision explaining why neither occurred. As years passed, the absence of these elements shaped how the case could be understood and misunderstood. Researchers, journalists, and later investigators encountered a record that appeared active but incomplete. Documents existed. Materials could still be examined. But the file offered no indication that all evidence had ever been reviewed together under a single evaluative framework. This distinction matters. Without a comprehensive review, no investigative direction could be formally ruled out. Without an administrative conclusion, no investigative direction could be formally confirmed. The case remained open, not because it was advancing, but because it had never been structurally positioned to conclude. Importantly, the record does not show a breakdown in effort. It shows a breakdown in convergence. Each component of the file continued to exist within the limits of its original scope. What never occurred was the act that would have transformed those components into a unified investigative judgment. This is why the case did not move decisively in one direction or another, not because the truth was unreachable, but because the file never created the authority required to define what resolution would mean. From an administrative standpoint, the case did not fail. It persisted, and persistence without convergence produces a specific outcome. A file that remains open by default, rather than by design. The unresolved nature of the case is not solely a matter of unanswered questions. It is the result of a record that never established the conditions necessary to answer them definitively. The file did not collapse under uncertainty. It stabilized within it. And that is why, decades later, the case exists not as a closed chapter, but as an enduring boundary, one defined less by what is unknown than by what the record itself never allowed to be known. This case remains open not because no one worked on it, but because the file never authorized a single path toward closure,